What if there was a massacre as brutal as Jallianwala Bagh happened around exact same time, right on Indian soil, but most of us were never taught its true nature? Mahatma Gandhi wrote about this. Dr. B.R. Ambedkar compared it to one of the worst religious massacres in European history. Subhas Chandra Bose documented it in a book that British immediately banned. The British Parliament debated it, and the international press covered it as it happened. The leadership of that generation knew exactly what went down, yet, for over a century, our history books took a massive communal slaughter and turned it into quiet footnote. In this video, we are going to look past the convenient political stories to examine what actually happened in Malabar in 1921, and more importantly, why the truth was buried. To understand how this happened, we have to look back at the landscape of 1921. Following the First World War, the Great Britain broke up Ottoman Empire, effectively ending the Islamic Caliphate. In response, Indian Muslims launched the Khilafat Movement. Mahatma Gandhi saw this as a massive political opportunity to unite Hindus and Muslims against the British rule. So, he got the Congress Party to back up the agitation. But when this global campaign reached the Malabar region of Kerala, it ran straight into a very old, volatile local conflict. For generations, there had been a deep economic and social tension between poor Muslim tenants, the Moplahs, and the wealthy Hindu landlords. On August 20, 1921, British police raided a local mosque to arrest Khilafat leaders. A rumor quickly spread that the mosque had been destroyed. The same night, an armed rebellion broke out. A local leader declared himself the king and set up a parallel government. For roughly 2 weeks, the British rule completely collapsed across the region. However, what began as a revolt against British Empire very quickly turned into something much more darker. Mobs targeted Hindu homes, destroyed temples, executed citizens, forced conversions, and drove thousands of families off their land. Today, a specific school of history still attempts to soften this tragedy by calling it a peasant uprising against rich landlords. But that logic completely falls apart under scrutiny. A prominent contemporary witness asked one simple question that thoroughly disproves the class war narrative. It's important to note that this book that I'm quoting from is originally written in Malayalam, which was translated into English. K. Mahadevan Nair wrote, that I quote, "If it was a war between the rich and poor, why were the rich among the Moplahs excluded from the lootings?" K. Mahadevan Nair was not an outsider looking back a century later. He was the first secretary of Kerala Pradesh Congress Committee. He witnessed the rebellion firsthand. It is very clear the targets were not chosen based on their wealth, they were chosen based on their faith. Think about how unfair this is to the victims. For decades, their descendants were effectively told your ancestors were not targeted for their religion. They just happened to be on the wrong side of wealth equation. That is not just bad history, it's an insult to the people who suffered. The accounts of violence are deeply disturbing, so I'm choosing to skip most of the graphic detail to keep this video watchable. But the world at the time knew exactly what was happening. Annie Besant, a fierce anti-colonial activist and a former president of the Indian National Congress, published a stark assessment of the ground reality in 1922. In her own words, I quote, "They established a Khilafat Raj, crowned a king, murdered and plundered abundantly, and killed or drove away all Hindus who would not apostatize. Somewhere about 1 lakh people were driven from their homes with nothing but the clothes they had on." It's important to note that Annie Besant was no British loyalist trying to paint Indian freedom fighters as villains. She was an anti-colonial leader who knew Malabar intimately. You cannot casually dismiss her words as colonial propaganda. Now, The actual counts of the people involved in this incident are fiercely debated, still being debated, but the baseline numbers are already stark from various sources. The armed Moplah resistance numbered between about 8,000 to 30,000. Of those, between 2,300 to over 12,000 were killed by British crackdown. About 600 to few thousand Hindu civilians were killed by the rebels, and thousands more were forcibly converted. In 1945, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar evaluated the event with absolute clarity. He refused to hide behind the political, polite language. He wrote, and I quote, "Massacres, forcible conversions, desecration of temples, brutal and unrestrained barbarism were perpetrated freely by Moplahs upon Hindus. This was not a Hindu-Muslim riot. This was just a Bartholomew." Ambedkar explicitly compared it to the Saint Bartholomew Day massacre in Paris, one of the bloodiest religious slaughters in European history. So, let us be clear, this was not some obscure, minor local clash. This was widely documented, widely condemned event. Which brings us back to the real question. Why did we grow up hearing almost nothing about it? The answer lies in a major political compromise. When Mahatma Gandhi tied the Indian independence struggle to the Khilafat movement, he and Ali brothers traveled to the Malabar coast to hold massive, highly charged rallies. They brought an intense religious messaging into a region which was already fractured by deep religious and class divides. And here is the most tragic part of the timeline. Senior nationalist leaders saw these warning signs. Sir C. Shankaran Naya, a former Congress president who actually belonged to Kerala, explicitly warned that mixing the freedom struggle with the religious Khilafat cause would lead to bloodshed. Prominent voices inside the movement practically pleaded with the leadership to recognize that local dynamics could not handle that kind of fuel. But these warnings were brushed aside for what was called the greater political good. The leadership chose a short-term national alliance over the long-term regional safety and characterization. And we already know how it turned into a disaster. On January 26, 1922, just months after the massacre stopped, Gandhi addressed the Malabar violence in his publication Young India. He wrote, and I quote, "The Moplahs are brave, God-fearing men who are fighting for what they consider as religion and in a manner which they consider as religious." Look at the timing of that statement. It's just months after a brutal incident. And Gandhi was not writing this before the facts emerged. By January 1922, the details of forced conversions, temple desecrations, the massacre, the killings, they were fully known to the senior leaders of Congress Party. But still, he chose to write this. To be fair, Gandhi did later call it Moplah madness and try to separate the broader freedom movement from the bloodshed. But he maintained the political alliance and never retracted his initial characterization of the attackers. It's important to note that this quote is not hidden away in some secret vault. It is sitting right there in the official archives published by the Government of India. And this is exactly why Malabar got written in our textbook as the way it did. It was not erased, it was repackaged, turned into a peasant revolt against feudal landlords, or even worse, quietly folded into a larger freedom struggle against the British. The religious massacre was simply cut out. It's too inconvenient. Teaching it honestly means putting Gandhi's own words on the page and showing that Congress leadership did not retract their alliance even after the religious massacre was fully documented. For generations, our historians simply refused to do that to Gandhi. To see the double standard here, we only have to place Malabar next to what every single Indian child knows by heart, Jallianwala Bagh. Every school child reads about Jallianwala Bagh in vivid, tragic detail. There are memorials, national days of mourning, and every Indian remembers it back of their hand. The Malabar Rebellion happened around exact same time, operated on an enormous scale, and lasted for months. Yet, our education system turned that into a brief, safe footnote. So the question is, why this double standard? Because both the British Empire and post independence Indian state had their own political reasons to bury this one. For British, the rebellion was a massive military and administrative humiliation. They completely lost control of the territory. Worse, their counter operation led to a horrific war crime. So, a colonial government was trying to cover up a military failure, and a brutal war crime had every reason to sweep this one under the rug. But the British left India in 1947. So, why did independent India continue to hide the full scope of this tragedy? Because Jallianwala Bagh fits a clean narrative: a cruel foreign oppressor versus a united, innocent Indian population. It gives history a very clear villain. Malabar, however, completely ruins the neat story India wanted to tell about its path to freedom. It was not British versus Indian, it was Indians turning on Indians on religious grounds. And the political alliance that triggered this whole event was a core project of Congress Party. It's too uncomfortable. So, to teach Malabar honestly, you would have to put Mahatma Gandhi's Young India quotes directly into middle school textbooks. You would have to explain to young students that a major political calculation by our founding leaders directly led to a communal slaughter. It was simply easier to soften the story because the actual truth was too uncomfortable to face. Now, some of you might be thinking, why does any of this actually matter today? Why dig up a 100-year-old scar? Because burying the dark parts of the history does not make them disappear. It just leaves the next generation completely blind to the phenomena. Look at countries like Germany or France. Germany does not hide Holocaust from its kids. They teach it inside out. Why? Because when a society looks at its ugliest chapters, honestly, it learns what to look out for in the future. It develops a defense mechanism against extremism. Hiding the ugly parts of our history leaves a dangerous trap. You cannot just bury truth forever, and when it finally breaks free because of whatever the phenomena like internet, it gets used as a political weapon rather than an honest lesson. Take a look at what happened in Kashmir Valley in 1990. The timeline was different, the weapons were modern, but the playbook was exactly the same. Think about it. In 1921, the state ignored the warning signs. In 1990, state did exactly the same thing. In 1921, a minority community was systematically targeted. In 1990, it happened again. In 1921, you had a mass forced exodus from a particular region. In 1990, a mass forced exodus against Kashmiri Pandits in the valley. The pattern fits. If we had taught the Malabar Rebellion with clinical honesty, we would have recognized these warning signs in Kashmir before they reached a point of no return. We would have known how the radicalization looks. We would have known the radicalization never starts with a massacre, it ends with one. It starts with a quiet polarization, a poster here, poster there, maybe one or two assassinations or subtle threats. But because India chose to forget 1921, when the exact same pattern showed up in the valley in late 1980s, the state acted completely surprised. We simply did not have the perspective to see what was coming our way. When the official history books leave a blank space, the popular culture inevitably steps in to fill it. But instead of clarifying the past, this often deeply muddles the public perception. Look at the film industry in Kerala about this particular concept. In 1988, a massive high-budget Malayalam film framed the rebellion entirely as a heroic war against the British Empire, essentially sidelining the entire religious angle. Then 100 years later, in 2020, a prominent director and a leading Malayalam actor announced a major new film. The entire pitch was to portray Haji, the king, the self-made one, was romanticized as the freedom fighter. But the internet age changes the rule of information nowadays, right? You can no longer control the narrative the way people used to in 1980s. The public backlash was so immediate and contemporary records were brought into public eye And the filmmakers ultimately backed out and just dropped the project entirely. But there was an attempt to revive the same fake narrative. Think about what that means. A century later, public is no longer accepting the sanitized version they were taught. And the institutions, importantly, are finally being forced to update the public records. In 2021, the Indian Council of Historical Research removed nearly 400 Malabar rebel leaders from official dictionary of freedom fighters. Predictably, sections of the media frame this as right-wing attempt at polarization. But interestingly, every source documenting the truth in the history, Madhavan Nair, Annie Besant, Shankaran Nair, Dr. Ambedkar, were left-leaning. So the media failed to see that this is a long overdue factual correction. So we get so caught up in arguing over political labels and forget the basic human question here. What actually happened to those families in Malabar back in 1921? What happened to those displaced 100,000 people? Unfortunately, that question remains unanswered. Before we close, we need to extend some grace to people who actually had to make these hard decisions in the past. To be fair, we have to view Gandhi's through the lens of 1920, not from the hindsight of fallout of 1921. From a purely tactical standpoint, it was easy to see why he backed the Khilafat movement. He needed to mobilize a massive unified front of India, both Hindu and Muslim, against the British rule. And at that time, it looked like a brilliant political calculation because we did not know what's going to happen. By the same token, it is entirely understandable why the leaders of independent India were terrified of this topic in 1947. The country had just survived horrific bloodbath of partition, and the new nation was bleeding and incredibly fragile. So if the logic at the time was, let's not pour more fuel onto raging fire, it's an understandable position to take for the newly formed government. But there is a statute of limitations on historical damage control. Hiding a disaster for 5 years makes sense. It's understandable emergency tactic. But hiding it for a century is a cover-up. And I think this cover-up is driven by appeasement and vote bank politics subsequently for all these decades. My view on this is we need to stop treating citizens like fragile children who will break the moment they discover that our founding icons made monumental errors in judgment. It's okay, it's human. If our national unity genuinely depends on burying hundreds of years of truth or communal slaughter, then we have to question how strong our national unity actually is. As citizens, we have an absolute right to the raw, unedited truth of our past, and we should be proud to discuss our past. If it is good or it is bad, it has to be in the public domain as a discussion. The goal here is not to keep the hatred alive across generations. It is to ensure we can recognize the exact same radical playbook when it surfaces again. Ultimately, we have to understand a very simple thing. A peace built on hidden history or distorted truth is structurally fragile. When the state spends a century hiding a simple truth which is well documented, citizens will eventually discover it on their own anyway. And when they do, they have every right to feel betrayed. Now, that is my rant. I would like to hear your perspective on this. Which other historical events do you believe have been systematically sanitized or repackaged or even removed from our textbooks? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for watching. Until next time, dig deeper.